It is wonderful to be with you all, whether you're in the Zoom or on the live stream. Thank you for joining us to celebrate, because Am Yisrael needs celebrations at times like this as well, during times of mourning as well. And we're in Elul, a time for us to zoom out to the bigger perspectives. And one of those perspectives is the triumph of life. If you haven't picked up the Triumph of Life yet, we hope you will. And it's your lucky day because we have a gift for you, that you can receive a 40% discount on the Triumph of Life. If you've made the mistake of not buying it yet, then you can now get that 40% discount since this is the month of Tshuva. So it is a delight to be here with Rabbi Yitz Greenberg, who serves as the president of the J.J. Greenberg Institute for the Advancement of Jewish Life, and as senior scholar in residence at Hadar. Together with Elie Wiesel, he founded Klal, the National Jewish Center for Learning and Leadership, and served as its president until 1997. From 1997 to 2008, he served as founding president of Jewish Life Network, Steinhardt Foundation, which created such programs as Birthright Israel and the Partnership for Excellence in Jewish Education. Rabbi Greenberg was one of the activist founders of the student struggle for Soviet Jewry in the movement to liberate Russian Jewry. He was a pioneer in the development of Holocaust education and commemoration, and was appointed by President Bill Clinton as chair of the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum in 2000. He's a leading Jewish thinker and has written extensively on post-Holocaust Jewish religious thought, Jewish-Christian relations, pluralism, and the ethics of Jewish power. Here at Uri L'Tzedek, he has been foundational to our vision of what it means to build an Orthodox social justice movement that is Torah-rooted and is balanced on various perspectives, embraces pluralism. He's also been central in the founding of our Progressive Orthodox Rabbinic Association, Torat Chaim, where we give out annual awards each year, the J.J. Greenberg Young Leadership Award, to recipients in Europe, in Israel, and North America, and we hope to do that for years to come, thanks to Rav Yitz and Blue's visionary leadership in honor of their beloved late son. And actually, Isaac Blumenthal here, my great colleague, is actually one of our past award recipients. So we're happy to have him. And I see many rabbis here as well, and we hope to get to your questions as well. So friends, thank you for being here. And Rav Yitz, thank you for joining us.
My pleasure. My pleasure.
So friends, we are here to discuss the Triumph of Life. So Rav Yitz, in your book, Triumph of Life, you suggest that Judaism's main vision, the main message in Judaism, is tikkun olam, repair of the world, i.e., a redemption of the world, turning the world into a Gan Eden, a Garden of Eden. Yet we know many Orthodox Jews today, and certainly prior to today, dismiss tikkun olam as some modern liberal cliche that neglects Jewish interests, rejects Jewish prioritization, to use all of our energy to help the rest of the world, often leads to neglect of our own Jewish needs and to assimilation. And so I would love to hear your response to that. I wouldn't even say prevalent, I would say dominant kind of worldview within Orthodoxy today, and kind of dovetailing with that, a little bit of just kind of your general vision of tikkun olam.
Well, let me confess that I use the language of tikkun olam in part. It is a liberal, much more popular modern thought, and it's not in the Torah at all. It's mentioned in a very limited way in rabbinic tradition and so on. It's mostly in Kabbalah, late Kabbalah, and even there, not in the use that we have today. So I freely confess I was trying to be provocative by using that term, partly because the main point was, in fact, it's one of the main points of the book. Judaism, in fact, stands for these values, even if it didn't call them these values. I particularly focus on the idea of messianism. in plain language, Messianism is a Jewish vision. My argument is everybody thinks of monotheism as the great Jewish contribution to world civilization, but I would argue this is number two, if not number one, namely, don't accept the status quo, transform it with the eventual promise that yes, you can make this world a paradise. If you look at the prophetic tradition, Messianism includes overcoming poverty, overcoming hunger, overcoming discrimination, all forms of inequality and discrimination, overcoming war, beat the swords into plowshares, overcoming sickness. Isaiah talks about the blind seeing and the deaf hearing and so on. To put it simply, Messianism implies overcoming all the enemies of life. And that's why I argue that the main Jewish message is, in fact, the triumph of life, that life will overcome all its enemies. And of course, it won't be done by itself. It will breed covenant, a partnership between God and humanity. But that claim that you shouldn't accept the status quo and that you can and will transform the world, that is, it seems to me, the essential message of Tikkun Olam. Now, Messianism, again, depends how you understand it. Some people, a big chunk of the Jewish traditional community, insist that all these good things will happen only for Jews. It's not for the whole world. Another version of this, runaway, irresponsible Messianism, we're seeing some of it in Israel now, that Messianism means that God will send this Redeemer, the Jewish people will rule over all. Israel can swallow up the Palestinians and everything else it wants to, because God will make sure, it doesn't matter if the world opposes or the other armies are stronger, God will make sure we win with the Messianism. Well, of course, those versions of Messianism I reject. But responsible, if you will, covenantal Messianism seems to me an extraordinarily important theme in Judaism and an important contribution to world civilization. Well, I should add one more comment. Yes, there are Jews who use Tikkun Olam as an excuse to focus all their energy on helping the rest of the world, neglecting, or in the name of universal, sometimes even abusing the Jewish needs and Jewish interests. The Jewish communists under Stalin, who persecuted religious Jews, who closed Jewish schools because they wanted to make the world revolution of equality and human dignity come quicker. These people also, excuse me one second. Okay, sorry. So the point is that this idea of universal destroying Judaism, undermining it, has been a major problem of Judaism, particularly in the last 200 years. Nevertheless, in my judgment, again, those people who go universal and destroy the Jewish dimension hurt the world, not just the Jewish people, as what happened with Stalinism. So all in all I'm saying is a balance of a universal messianism with a particular covenantal method of getting there. That's Judaism's not only model, but contribution to the whole world, not just to ourselves.
Beautiful, beautiful. So, I would love to reflect a little bit, or have you reflect on what's unique about a covenantal approach to Tikkun Olam. The book has so many layers of description of that, and I wonder if you could highlight a few features of the Brit.
It's a good example. Again, it's a paradox or a dialectic of Jewish religion, because we do have a universal religion vision. That vision, as I just described, means overcoming really war, poverty, hunger for everybody, sickness for everybody. It's revolutionary and transformational, achieving universal equality. But the last 200 years have seen more movements to transform the world than universal equality and dignity than ever before in human history. But those very movements are mostly the record of the most horrific, destructive movements of the last 2 centuries. Communism, Marxism, Stalinism, which turned into Chinese version Maoism, and the Khmer Rouge, or for that matter, Nazism, National Socialism. It sought to overcome the inequalities and the suffering economically of the capitalist system. That's the socialist part. And the national part was, we're not going to have a war of the classes, as Bolsheviks claim. We're going to have one national unity as we make everybody equal. So in the name of making everybody equal and overcoming the ills of modern society, and for that matter, throw in eugenics, getting rid of the disabled and the underdeveloped, developmentally disabled in order to perfect the human race, Nazism committed the greatest crimes on millions, and of course, the greatest assault on life in the Holocaust of the Jewish people. So this is my point. This vision of universal Gan Eden and equality could easily become runaway messianism, runaway totalitarianism. What saved it is this method. In other words, what I call the covenantal method. The covenantal method says you don't achieve it by coercion, by force, by destroying the human beings who stand.
We are showing our support for Kamala Harris before early voting even starts. And in this final
Friends,
stretch,
if you can please mute yourselves. There we go. Thank you. Sorry about that, Rabbi Yitz.
Okay. All right. So the point is, these movements became runaway because the ideal vision became so demanding and so driven that it was willing to override and even destroy every human who stood in its path. The covenant says the opposite. It says no coercion. It says if you have to, you compromise. It says incremental. You can bring a total revolution, but one step at a time, no faster than at a human pace, no faster than humans can change. When you try to change 100% overnight, you get flashback, you get resistance, you get distortions. So the covenant says, marry that universal, equal living vision with particular, incremental, voluntary, compromising, respectful interaction in a partnership model. The partnership is not just between God and humans. Of course, it starts with the partnership with God and humans. That's the Noahide covenant. And then it turns into particular versions. Abraham and Sinai, the Jewish version. And I argue in the book, there are other covenantal communities because God works in pluralist fashion with the range of human race. But the Jews are meant to be a model and a co-worker and a teacher of these ideas. In any event, by marrying a much more incremental and particular and respecting humans and compromising method with the vision of universal redemption, that's the secret how this can be life-affirming and strengthening instead of runaway, we've seen in the last 20 years, turning into totalitarianism and into persecution and destructiveness. So I consider that a very major part of it. And of course, covenant, in the book, I try to give many examples. Covenant means you go at a human pace. You don't change faster than people are ready to change. You can push them, but you can't override them and force them into massive change overnight. It goes in a human scale. You don't save the whole world. You think global, but you work local. You start with one people, Jewish people. You start with one day, Shabbat, which is an ideal redemptive day. You start with one country, Israel, and you widen and you widen and you widen. And of course, everybody can do this process. So the covenant has this wonderful mix of transformative vision, revolutionary ideals, but realistic, gradual, and humanly respecting methods. And the combination is what makes Judaism a source of blessing. And the combination is what's needed. It's one of our contributions now to the world to prevent other ideal systems from running away. And it's needed to be a model of how, in a pluralist way, many religions can work together to help each other, and not just religions, but ways of living, secular movements as well.
Very nice. Rav Yitz, in Orthodoxy, as you know, the conversation is almost always about the halacha, the halacha. Triumph of Life speaks of covenantal actions rather than of halacha. Can you share a little bit about what the difference is?
Well, it's a good question. Partly under the influence, maybe in a major way, under the influence of Rabbi Joseph Soloveitchik, of blessed memory, the idea of halacha, Jewish law, commandments, practices, being the authentic or the most central way of Jewish religious expression. But halacha in the Soloveitchikan imagery, and in most of his students particularly, becomes a legal system. And the legal system operates by legal processes. There are many good things in the legal system, but it also gives overwhelming weight to precedents. And it seems to me that that is too narrow a conception. I'm arguing that what the halacha should be understood as, and this is the halacha not just for Orthodox Jews, but for all Jews. It says that if you want to live covenantally, that is to say, you want to live on the side of life, if you want to make sure that your life and your people and your community are working for the increase and the triumph of life in this world, live on the side of life, then you go into life. There's the collective dimension as a people, as a society, as a nation. You work for, yes, greater equality, ending discrimination, overcoming poverty. One could go on and on, investing in curing of sickness. That's the collective action. But the individual action, and this is my point where it's covenantal act, practice is not legal. What the halacha really stands for is the covenant idea. You want to live on the side of life, and literally, if you want to, if you want to study, can you hear me?
That's great.
If you want to study and you want to apply, take every life action, study it and reshape it to be on the side of life, or at least to the maximum possible. So what does that mean? The specific details, what it means is eating. Eating, of course, if you don't eat, you will die. So eating is certainly on the side of life. But how you eat could be on the side of life. Kashrut is an attempt to shape eating in that direction. What do I mean? First of all, kashrut is really about, I argue this in the book, is about being a vegetarian, according to the Torah in the Garden of Eden originally, and in the future Messianic age, according to Isaiah, we'll all be vegetarians. I want to put it another way. You maximize life when you live and you're eating, make sure that other living creatures don't have to die so that you can live. And secondly, kashrut says minimize death. When you kill the animal by shchita, let it die painlessly and swiftly rather than suffering. And one could go on and on, and that is my argument in the book. You don't stop with the limited ritual kashrut. For example, eco-kosher, make sure you don't eat overfished species because that'll be a death of those species. It means making sure that the workers are properly treated and make sure that we end the abuse in slaughterhouses or raising chickens under such crowded conditions that they are literally driven to suffering and pain before they're killed. In short, that is the way in which when you study this action, and of course it means eating healthy, not excessive fat, not excessive sugar, not excessive salt. That is the covenantal way of making sure that the eating is on the side of life. Now go through the whole system. How about speaking? Words can be life-affirming, encouraging, loving, giving people new possibilities and new experiences, inspirational, ethical, and words can be degrading, destructive, stereotyping, and demeaning, and they can drag people down. In short, every word you speak can be on the side of life, quality of life, improve life, or on the side of degradation, lower quality of life, and so on. So that's a covenantal rethinking of speaking, which is partly achieved by our existing halacha, and there's much room for much greater, particularly in the last few decades, there's been a major effort to rethink and go through language to make sure it doesn't give males superior and put down women, to make sure it does not degrade other groups and the minorities and so on. To me, these are all very important constructive ideas of how do you reshape speaking to be on the side of life. But there is literally no limit to this approach. In fact, I consider one of the more important claims in the book that the goal of restudying all of life behaviors is the Jewish claim that literally there's no moment of life, there's no personal behavior, there's no life action that cannot be reshaped to maximize life content and reduce death or pollution content. I'll give an example about transportation. Transportation, there can be a rating system basing on its affirmation of life. For example, mass transit has the lowest carbon footprint, therefore it is religiously and ethically the highest form. And if you go to a private car, I would argue again, electric cars, which are less polluting, are at a higher level and should be prioritized over fossil fuel cars, and so on and so forth. In other words, that's the central claim of the covenant, and it's available to everybody, not just to Jews. You have to go through the workplace and see that it's structured in such a way that it's not demeaning and degrading to its workers, but rather it uses their self-respect and their dignity and their capacity. It honors that in the way it gives them work and the way it guides their work, the way it gives them work opportunities. So this is, to me, the Jewish contribution that needs to be incorporated in Jewish life, but no less can be adopted and applied to every aspect of societal life.
Beautiful, Rabbi Yitz. Picking up on that point, you call for a fundamental Orthodox shift on LGBTQ issues and same-sex marriage. Can you talk a little bit about what that shift is and why?
Well, let me also say that the book is deliberately, and it draws upon the Orthodox tradition. I'm an Orthodox Jew, and I've had the good fortune of studying and learning from the classic texts. That having been said, I consider myself a pluralist, and the book is written to speak to and for every Jew on the spectrum of Jewish existence. Now, let me come to the LGBTQ issue. Here's a problem, or here is a challenge, which, unfortunately to say, the traditional community has been behind, and the liberal community and the secular community have been ahead in this matter. The Torah has a very hostile, rejecting attitude to the LGBTQ. Now, my argument in the book is that reflects the acceptance and the understanding in society of homosexuality at that time. Meaning what? That homosexuality, let's say as it's portrayed in the Greek myths, say, or in the Iliad, when you look at Achilles and Patroclus, his sex toward a partner. The homosexuality there is, in this case, Achilles, a male who is capable of heterosexual excitement and response, but who doesn't care so much for his family or his wife or his interest, but rather he wants to go off with his buddies to war, which he finds more meaningful. And while he's at war, he has these relationships with, in this case, Patroclus, his sidekick, but it's a relationship based not on love and mutual respect. It's based on possession, power, control. So a homosexuality that's based on possession and control, that rejects or looks down upon family. In fact, that's a major factor. Again, you hang out with the boys in war, you don't have to waste time with the children and family. So that kind of homosexuality, the Torah rejects. I think that's a legitimate position, even though one doesn't accept anymore the idea that this is fatal or punishable by death. Having said that, my argument is, as a modern Orthodox Jew, and I would apply it to anybody, including liberal and secular Jews who are modern experience, we now know that homosexuality is not a perversion. It is a factor based on both genetic and hormonal factors, in which it's a small minority, but it's a real minority on the spectrum of normal sexual activity. That minority is attracted to same-sex people. And now, again, part of the history of homosexuality is, as a culture, it was promiscuous. But I believe that reflects the attitude of society, the rejection, the outside status, and so on. What we're hearing now in the same-sex marriage movement and from significant members of the gay community is that they believe this is not only normal and natural, but they wish to be lived by and be judged by the same standards that the tradition applies to heterosexuality. Namely, sexuality is a fundamental human experience. It is the way we express and develop relationship. It's the way we develop and express love. And therefore, it is to be affirmed. And some of the Orthodox rabbis have tried to say, well, you can be gay, but you shouldn't practice it. It seems to me violate this principle. If we understand that it's hormonal and genetic and natural, then it seems to me we have to say, try to meet the standards by which we judge and encourage all forms of sexuality. Namely, build it on relationship. It should grow out of relationship. It should express relationship and deepen relationship. Build it on faithfulness, monogamy. It's not promiscuous because it seeks to build depth and commitment between the partners, which enriches the love and deepens it. And third, and not least, it's open to family. It's open to creation of children. It's open to maintaining marriage and family in order to raise children. Such a homosexuality should be not just tolerated. Again, the more avant-garde of orthodoxy is saying be kind and welcome them and don't persecute them. But I'm arguing beyond that, treat them and judge them as you would heterosexual couples. Celebrate their love when it meets these tests of faithfulness and commitment and relationship and family. And I think that is a good example of a number of areas where not just Orthodoxy, but religious people can keep the best values of the past, but also be able to innovate and to apply them into new areas and new people in order to maximize, again, I keep saying maximize love, to maximize life, the creation of life in our society.
Thank you so much. Okay, before we get to Israel politics, let's start with US politics. In a presidential election year, some say that one side will do more for Israel, but less for vulnerable populations, while the other side will do less for Israel, but more for vulnerable populations. And I wonder, how do we think about those competing moral commitments?
Well, you just, of course, sounded the theme that every mature religious person, ethical person comes through us. Sometimes in life, there are conflicts, not of bad and good, but conflicts between good values and the need to live up to them. In this case, what you're suggesting, at least this is one of the main claims. I don't know how detailed I want to get here. I think you all can see. Yes, the Republican Party particularly has tried to say that it is committed to Israel. Former President Trump has argued that he did more for Israel than anybody else, and therefore he should be voted for by all Jews. That's the argument, and of course, again, the majority, a substantial majority of the Jewish people seems to be saying that the values of the Democratic Party, in this case, care for the vulnerable, care for the broader health education, one can go on and go on, the right to abortion, and so on, that this is more important, and this is what reason we as Jews vote for the Democratic Party. My point is, we have to be aware of the potential tension. And in fact, I will say again, I am concerned. On the one hand, the Biden administration, the President Biden, stood by Israel after October 7th in an exemplary way. It's also clear that as his concern for losing the swing state of Michigan grew, and he has tried to soften or win over the Arab Americans, and some not always by maintaining the proper moral clarity that he showed at the beginning. So my answer is that's also part of democratic politics. The fundamental point is, if Israel was existentially in danger, then I think it's legitimate for a Jew, by the policies of these parties, it's legitimate Jew to say, I prioritize that, I vote that first. Because in general, morality and ethics start with your own family, start with your own immediate. It's very legitimate as long as you don't confine it to your own immediate family and your own people. On the other hand, to the extent that we try to incorporate all these values, we say, what's the balance? And it seems to me that there's significant leadership of the Democratic Party by making clear that they will stand by Israel and that they will protect it and keep it as an important American ally. And therefore, one, in weighing the various things, one can give greater weight to the environmental issues, to the vulnerable populations that need help, to greater respect and help for the poverty and children in poverty. So again, my answer is, this is an answer. I don't want to give each particular person, they have to make their own judgment. But I think the way to see it is to realistically assess the needs, the urgency, the dangers on all sides, and then to vote for and pick that which meets the widest range of needs in the most constructive forms. At the risk of now becoming even more politically on this matter, I will say the threat to democracy also must be weighed very heavily as a factor in my vote, both in America and in my judgment in Israel also, where we have another kind of political crisis going on.
Thank you, Rav Yitz. We have a question from one of our participants here, Professor Eric Kaplan, who is a professor of Jewish studies at McGill. And he asks, because of the centrality of tikkun in your thought, including the role that Jewish sovereignty can play in modeling a better world, he wonders, and I'm sure many of us do, how you view Israel's response to the horrors of October 7th. This is obviously a very complex issue with many layers to it. And I wonder if you might reflect, based on your theology, how this last year you think has gone in living up to those ideals.
It's a good question. One of the main themes in the book is my belief that the divine message of covenant includes in particular, and in fact, my argument in the book is that the covenant has been renewed. It's not the same covenant we had in biblical times. It's now in its third stage. And each stage has been marked by God self-limiting and asking humans, the human partner, to take more responsibility. In my belief, therefore, modernity and its message, which was to human beings to take power and to improve the world and to overcome the enemies of life, that's a very major part of modernity. One reason it was so appealing to Jews is that in addition to giving them citizenship and equality and emancipation, it evoked all these messianic visions of overcoming poverty, of overcoming war, of overcoming sickness, and said, hey, you can do it by taking power. And that was its appeal. Now, in my judgment, I argue, therefore, it's the divine will, it's the religious response to take power. And those who don't take power are irresponsible and not doing the word of God. And that's step number one. Furthermore, the so-called secularists who are taking power and using it properly are doing the covenantal work and God's work, in my judgment, as much as or more than religious people who are not taking power or who are not exercising it with proper justice and fairness and responsibility for environment and for people. So I start with that now. Therefore, in my judgment, Zionism and Israel taking power, the Jewish people taking power to create Israel, was the religious calling and a great step forward in moving the world toward tikkun. And as you, Professor Kaplan, just said, it's a chance to show a role model to the whole world of how do you exercise power ethically and responsibly. Now that brings me to October 7th, and since then. So my argument personally is that I believe that Israel, for 75 years, not just for 1 year, 11 months, has represented just that, taking power with all the faults that are inescapable when you take power. If you never have an army, you will never kill an innocent civilian. If you have an army, no matter how well you try, no matter how ethically you exert yourself, you will kill innocent civilians. So an ethic of power cannot be simply an ideal model as if there is no context. Having said that, so Israel has exercised that power on the whole, on the balance, in my judgment, in a highly responsible and restrained fashion, and a constructive fashion. Let me give the best example. In the War of Independence, which Israel barely survived, the invasion of Arab nations trying to destroy it, and a war which led to serious clashes, and yes, led to a Nakba for Palestinians, although my point is a lot of that Nakba they brought upon themselves. Not only that they were told to leave by some of their leadership, but in the attempt of the Arab nations to destroy Israel and the war that led to driving out, as well as people leaving, Arabs leaving because of the conditions of war. So that is, but look at that history. In the first years after the state, the Arabs, Israeli Arabs, were governed by military government. They didn't fully trust them. And that military government was replaced by civilian administration and admission to the democratic process. And as time has gone on, there has been greater, again, Arabs in Israel, Israeli Arabs, are not yet at full equality levels, very much as African Americans are for the most part not yet at the equal level of the white population of the United States of America. But it's a process, and it's in process, and there's been a steady improvement. The most recent peak being the admission for the first time of an Arab party into the ruling coalition. So my answer is, that's an example of how power both evolves responsibly with all its flaws. Israel has kept that movement going. Now, in the initial response to October 7th, I want us to keep in mind the major shock. The major shock of October 7th was the realization that Hamas is not just verbalizing in its charter that it wants to obliterate Israel, that it fully intends to, that the Jewish fantasy or the Israeli fantasy or dream or hope that Hamas was evolving into a governing responsible party and would subordinate the attempt to wipe out Israel to the making a better life, that they were wrong. And secondly, that Hamas was able to trick the Israelis and overwhelm the inadequately prepared or unprepared army, and not only cause the greatest massacre since the Holocaust, but cruelly, viciously rape and kill children in the presence of parents, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So in the initial shock of that, yes, there was a great temptation, and I will not swear that maybe, I will not swear to that Israel may have been harsher or more destructive than it needed to be. But yeah, but on balance, even that, come back to the basic fact. According to the Hamas health ministry claims 40,000 people have died. Now that's heartbreaking. That's heartbreaking. But any death of any innocent person is heartbreaking, let alone the death of 40,000 people. But if you break down that number, there's a good reason to believe, by the way, that the number is overstated by a good 10,000, but that's not the issue. What's even more falsely reported is that Hamas for many months claimed that 70% of the victims were women and children, implying that Israel was targeting civilians. That turned out to be false. The more accurate number is now estimated as under 10,000, or to put another way, less than 25%. Now, but even 25% is heartbreaking, but now analyze one step further. Of the 40,000, Israel has reasonable estimates that it's killed 17 or 18,000 fighters. So that means the ratio of fighters killed to civilians killed is 1 to 1.2, 1.4. Now that is an unprecedentedly low level of civilian casualties. Now again, it's harsh and devastating to think that in defending your life, you're killing any innocents, let alone to say, well, it's only 1.1, but one has to judge that, because in war, Richard Kemp, the head of the British forces in Afghanistan, said the Allies made a major decision that they win over the population from the Taliban. They have to reduce civilian casualties. They went all out. They reconsidered all their methods, all their tactics, and they brought it down, he said, to 3 or 4 civilians to 1 fighter. Israel, by bringing it down to 1.2, 1.4 fighter, civilians to a fighter, is showing a remarkable restraint in the exercise of its power. So why are there so many more casualties? Well, the first answer is because in the past when they fought, they would try to kill leader and they would scratch a mission if that leader was surrounded by too many civilians. But they understood after October 7th that every Hamas fighter is a potential and actual killer and wants to kill, and therefore they have to fight them and just kill them before they kill us. And when you attack fighters, A, the numbers go up, not just leaders. The numbers go up, and B, Hamas turns out has systematically placed its fighters in the civilian population. It systematically used schools, mosques, hospitals for command and control centers. It systematically did not build air raid shelters because it didn't care about the lives of its civilians. In fact, it believed the more civilians die, the more the world will support them against Israel. So in fact, again, my argument is by the standards of an ethic of power, Israel is still at a very high level of restraint and moral responsibility. And in the real world, I think has been much exaggerated the criticism that it's killing too many Palestinian civilians. That having been said, my answer is it's good that people press it, and it's good as a pressure. I also want to say realistically, to me, very dismaying but true, that for the first time in Israeli history, substantially influential in the government, it's not the first time because there were other parties that were hostile to Arabs or put Arab lives as lesser, but it never had the influence and the presence. And in my judgment, it's a danger. It's a danger to Israeli democracy. It's a danger. There's pressure from the extreme right wing or from the gun reviewers and Smotriches to abuse Arabs, to not care about their lives. Israel, for example, again, Israel saw the crisis of food in Gaza. It started to send in food and aid, humanitarian aid, for weeks before it became public. Why is it not public? Because Smotrich and Ben Gvir wanted our Palestinians to die. And the prime minister, to his shame, was afraid to say publicly that we're very concerned about Palestinian starvation. Their lives are very important, and starvation is not an acceptable tactic. He should have said it publicly. He didn't. And leaving the impression that Israel was ready to practice starvation. That false impression was exploited for the International Criminal Court of Justice to take a case against Israel when in fact they never practiced starvation. Good, about 2 or 3 months ago, finally, a UN organization that focuses on starvation and hunger publicly acknowledged it never was, and it was exaggerated and they recognized it never happened, never was practiced. So to summarize, and this is Kevin's main question, summarize in my judgment, flaws, failures, and yes, a very high, sad, heartbreaking level of innocence of civilians. But in the real world, I think on balance, Israel has maintained a very responsible level of using power with restraint and to prevent targeting civilians. And that's part of the heartbreak of the reality of human history now, that in order to survive, that Israel, in fact, has to continue this kind of a war, or in the case of Hezbollah, in the exchange with Hezbollah, yes, many civilians in Lebanon's side have had to leave and get out of the way, and their lives are turned over. But again, I see no way of escaping this And so the real challenge becomes not just for Israel exercising restraint, but the rest of the world cracking down on Hamas, cracking down on the Palestinian support of Hamas. I want to remind you that according to the polls, 80% of West Bank Palestinians supported what was done on October 7th by Hamas. So in my judgment, to improve Israel's moral performance, it needs help from the allies of the Palestinians to tell them that they have to reject Hamas, that they have to turn from this attempt to destroy the Jewish state, if they really want a two-state solution, to turn from this attempt to destroy the Jewish state, to focus themselves on their own culture, on democratizing the Palestinian Authority, on improving the economy and their way of living, and yes, on disarming and rejecting terrorism. And if the rest of the population does that, then I believe they can win back the trust of Israel, win back the Israeli majority that 20 years ago offered a Palestinian state, but now is convinced that such a state would be a weapon of destruction and of threat to Israel's existence. So they can win back the Israeli trust by their own behavior, and their own allies should stop, like Turkey or the college campus Hamas activists should stop encouraging them to be their worst and start telling them, shift your own tactics to the side of life and respect, and we will be able to get you, and we will find many allies on the Jewish side, the Israeli side, to get you that state that you would deserve.
So great. So Rav Yitz, picking up on this last point around the side of life, and maybe our last question for today. We talk about Melech Chafetz B'Chaim, especially as we enter Rosh Hashanah. God loves life, and the triumph of life, prioritizing the quantity of life, the quality of life, the affirmation of life. Why is life so significant in Jewish thought? I mean, we could have said what was most significant was justice or truth or love or holiness. And your argument is, of course, those are important, but that life is what God loves, what Torah wants, what covenant is about. Can you wrap up your talk today on this idea?
Well, of course, again, keep in mind, like all theologians, I'm writing after the fact. In other words, if God had asked my opinion, would God have made life the first basic principle of tradition? Maybe, maybe not. So yes, I certainly think justice, loving kindness, and so on, these are all fundamental values that could have been held up as the fundamental value. I'm amazed and impressed and moved by the fact that in the end, it's none of the above. It's not none of the above, they're all of the above, but they are secondary, or rather in the service of life. Now, it's in part because of the reality. In other words, the most wondrous, the most remarkable, miraculous thing about all of the world that we know of, the creation, is life. Think of the capacities of life, and think of the originality and interest. I sometimes think maybe God chose life because life is more fascinating and more fun and more charming than justice or equality. But it's like babies are irresistible. So the answer, and mothers and fathers respond to them almost spontaneously, but genetically, they win their hearts and they respond positively. So I feel somewhat the same way. God responds, and you see that in the first chapter of Genesis. When life shows up, God says a blessing, and then follows that blessing with pruruvu, give me more, multiply. So the answer is, in part of life is lovable and fascinating and intriguing and charming and creative. Secondly, and this is certainly part of it, life can grow and develop to the point, and this is what Jewish religion is all about, in the form of humans. This is the highest form of life so far. And in the form of Homo sapiens, the most developed form of human life so far, they're capable for the first time of actually understanding the divine vision, the divine dream. God loves all God's creatures. Rachamav al kol masav, it says in the Ashrei prayer in the Psalms. But here is the first form of life that can understand not only God's love for creatures, but what God wants for those creatures, a paradise, a world which sustains them, which entertains them, which treats them with dignity, which does not torture them or deprive them. So this is God's dream. And for the first time, here's a form of life that grows and is able to carry out this vision. So that God enters into covenant. So that you might say God chooses life in part because justice is something that makes life better, that makes life fairer, that respects the dignity of human beings. But justice is not capable of growing into a partner, into a joint worker, into a teacher who teaches these values and communicates them to others. So for all these reasons, and maybe I should add the final reason, when the Torah asks, we're just in the last few weeks of Deuteronomy, how come God chose the Jewish people? Torah says, no answer, it's love. Can you explain love? Love is not really caused by the fact that this woman I love is beautiful or smart or even kind or good. It's a kind of an intangible chemistry, a personal response, a spiritual blending. So God has fallen in love with life and asks us to respect and advance life, become his partners or her partners in joining in fixing a world that supports life. Of course, saying it's very beautiful, but to look at the world around us, it's a great gap. And I, for one, as much of Israel, I'm in shock at this incredible resurgence of anti-Semitism, of hatred, of willingness in the name of anti-colonial ideology, in the name of so-called intersectionality, false ideology, to in effect say Jewish lives and the existence of Israel is dismissed, and one has a right to wipe out and kill. And yes, rape is a legitimate form of resistance. So again, I want to admit the truth. There is still a vast gap between the world as it should be and could be according to Jewish tradition. And our goal is to get there, and the actual world as it really is. But what the covenant teaches us is it's in our hands. We can move it. There have been major, major breakthroughs in overcoming poverty, overcoming hunger, and overcoming sickness in the last 200 years. If we can now marry that accomplishment back to a covenantal sense of partnership, of accountability, that we're not the masters of the universe. We're accountable to God and God's creation. We are partners with other nations and other people and other generations to improve the world. If we can recover that sense of partnership, that means restraint. That means we'll stop the pollution, stop the species destruction, stop the environmental global warming. So that is what I'm saying Judaism is offering the world now. A chance to build on the accomplishments, to increase human power beyond anything ever done before, but to channel it through partnership, both with God and humans, for life, for improving the world. And we should not allow the discouragement of being so far from what we are, not be driven by this outburst of hatred and viciousness into giving up. The greatness of the covenant has always been that after the destruction, the Jews came right back and they rebuilt. After the Shoah, we had the greatest outburst of life in Jewish history in building the state of Israel and then all through the world in renewing Jewish life and Jewish culture and Jewish living. So I hope my book is a source of hope in that it argues it's in our hands and the hands of this generation as carriers, and of course we will have to pass it on to our children and our grandchildren as the carriers of this vision and this mission to change and develop power, to develop our capacity for love and responsibility and mutual care, and now channel it to an even greater restoration of life. And yes, I hope in that process we will be able to overcome war and yes, end the death of innocents. But until then, we have the grimy, daily, gritty day work of covenantal life. And that is the calling and the opportunity of this generation.
Beautiful, beautiful, Rav Yitz. So inspiring. Your life, your work, your theology has been so inspiring to me and to so many. And may we continue to live in the dialectical tensions of supporting covenantal action each day to work towards tikkun olam. we wish you good health.
I know we have
Yes.
time. Am I allowed
Yeah.
to say that one of the things I love about you and about your work has been just that I think it's a model of looking out for the vulnerable, of placing priority on taking care of yatomim, of orphans, on protecting animals against abuse. I mean, I can't think of a single activity. Tave Yosher, looking out for the workers in kosher restaurants. I think it's a model for all of us. The energy, the giving of a kidney from a living donor yourself to save somebody else's life. It seems to me, again, I this is not a quid pro quo, but I think, yes, to me, you are the model of orthodoxy, being a model of ethical and human responsibility, of serving God by serving God's creatures and God's most vulnerable creatures the most. So thank you for the opportunity to talk about it.
Thank you so much. Friends, Rav Yitz, we wish you good health and strength and continued inspiration to share your teachings. Friends, we put the link to the book in the chat. We also put the code, if you want the discount code, that you can use to pick up that book. Thank you all so much for joining us. Chodesh Tov and Shana Tova. God bless.
Be well.